You may be seated. As we read, the final blow has fallen on Egypt in this morning's reading. But if we followed the entire arc of the parasha, we note that unlike the first 9 plagues, there was some delay between the time that the message of the plague was delivered and the time it befell Egypt. Before the plague, 2 things need to happen first. One, the Israelites are told that they have to go and ask of their Egyptian neighbors for stuff. Torah says things of gold and silver and clothing. Come on, give it. And they must prepare for the first Pesach. And the Torah explains that the Egyptians were positively disposed towards the Israelites. And so when the Israelites said, hand over some gold and some silver and some fancy clothes, they said, sure. And the commentators kind of struggle with this one a little bit. First, they notice that the text emphasizes on several occasions that the Israelites do exactly what Moses tells them. So when Moses says, go ask your Egyptian neighbors, they're going, okay, sure, no problem. I don't know about you, but this is not my image of the Israelites, right? And if you think even earlier in the story, when Moshe first appears and says, God has sent me to save you, they listen. But when Moshe's first encounter with Pharaoh goes badly, they turn on Moses. And yet here we're told not once, but several times that the Israelites do what Moses says. And the Torah then says something very intriguing, that Moshe was esteemed in the land of Egypt amongst Pharaoh's court and amongst the Egyptian people. A fascinating statement. Nachmanides highlights for us the degree to which that this feels dissident. After all, when you think about people who are leaders of freedom movements, they're not usually popular amongst the oppressors against whom they are fighting. Not that long since we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but I imagine that Dr. King was not highly regarded by Governor Wallace and his administration. I'm not so sure that he was highly esteemed by President Johnson. So why would we think that Moses and the Israelites would suddenly be so popular amongst Egyptians? Nachmanides, in seeking to explain this, says we need to understand the verse in 2 ways. First, he says, the esteem element reflects the attitude of the Israelites towards Moses. In other words, Moshe's esteem has risen amongst the people, which is why they're so willing to listen to him. But amongst the Egyptians, we don't really want to see the word esteem, but rather that Pharaoh's court and the Egyptians have come to see Moses as a person of stature who represents a powerful God and is someone to be feared. Not someone esteemed, but someone to be feared. Moshe's status has grown significantly over the last series of plagues that have afflicted the Egyptians. Moshe has come to be sort of this embodiment of the power of the God of Israel, a power that can destroy Egypt. And it is in this exercise of power that Moshe comes to be feared by the Egyptians and respected by the Israelites. Our Parsha presents us with this interesting dichotomy between fear and esteem, and suggests that what has happened in Egypt is the fear that the Egyptians had up to this incident was a fear of Pharaoh, a fear that they now have of Moshe as God's representative. And it goes to the heart of the question of how do you exercise power over your people? Pharaoh exercises power through fear. And only when some greater fear comes along do the Egyptians begin to change their attitudes and their ideas. The Israelites, the exercise of divine power that they associate with Moses does not cause them to fear Moshe, but it does cause them to respect and appreciate him. Moshe's exercise of power is ultimately a power by consent. And we know from the Israelites, often by dissent. They're not afraid of him. They're not afraid of the God that he represents because they expect that might will be in the service of right and not merely an expression of control. Thinking about this dichotomy, when I came across an intriguing article in the New York Times by a columnist named David French. Ever read any of his material? Fascinating. I like reading him a lot. Is very much steeped in his Christian faith and brings that Christian faith perspective to his writing. And as I was reading this piece, which is entitled, Why Are So Many Christians So Cruel? And he says, wherever I go lately, this is the question that everybody seems to ask me. And for him, it is a telling question because he sees in some elements of the Christian world a betrayal of authentic Christianity. Leave that there for a moment. We'll come back to it soon. But I started to think about how he talks about the exercise of power. He writes as follows. It's a simple question with a complicated answer, but that answer often begins with a particularly seductive temptation, one common to people of all faiths, that the faithful, those who possess eternal truth, are entitled to rule. Under this construct, might makes right, and right deserves might. Most of us, he goes on, have sound enough moral instinct to reject the notion that might makes right. power alone is not a sufficient marker of righteousness. That's the reality of our Torah portion over these number of weeks. Pharaoh, as an expression of his faith, believes that he has the right divinely of power and the right to exercise it over anyone and everyone. He has no qualms whatsoever or concerns about the harm he might inflict, even as it hurts his own people. And as I reflected more, I realized this is the dynamic of struggle of our era. I've been blessed to see in the last few weeks a renewed exchange of hostages held by Hamas and the other terrorists in Gaza. Their release is a blessing, but it's coming with a very heavy price. But step back, and what's the image that Hamas is trying to portray? They have themselves wrapped in military garb, their faces hidden, trying to project an air of power that comes from a sense of rightness. And because they are so convinced of their rectitude, they assert this idea that might makes right. That is how they've governed Gaza for the last 20 years. It is through fear, through oppression, not through esteem, not through a sense of being blessed by their leadership. Many in Gaza would feel free to stand up and dissent the way the Israelites routinely do throughout the Torah. Not many. At least not any that want to have a life to live. Us is cut from the same cloth as Pharaoh. The sense of rectitude that they are empowered and entitled to do whatever they want. But David French makes a really valid point when he says that this is the seductive temptation common to people of all faiths, that the faithful are the ones who possess the eternal truth and therefore have the right to exercise power. So let's maybe look a little more on our side of the ledger. Easy to put up Pharaoh as the villain or Hamas as the villain. But in the last 18 months, perhaps even longer, I don't know that there are not villains who wear our familiar garb. Bezalel Smotrich and Gvir, two ministers in the Israeli government, are rooted in this same belief that they alone possess eternal truth and therefore the right to do whatever they want. People in Gaza, the people in the West Bank, and even to those in Israel who oppose them. Ways, their enabler is Mr. Netanyahu, who exercises power not exclusively for the benefit of his citizens, but for himself and his chosen few. Bring the whole question a little bit closer to home. David French's definitions also reflect on the rise of Christian nationalism. The idea that they alone possess ultimate truth. And if they possess ultimate truth, then Chaverim, apparently we can't. A very, very discomforting. And reality is that this embrace of faith marks the darker side. It's evidence of ambition, but not love of community. It's evidence of the desire to exercise power over one's neighbor without any regard for what is best for your neighbor. It is the ultimate betrayal of any true faith tradition. We are to truly be in the Abrahamic faith traditions, descendants of Abraham. We ought to act a little bit more like Abraham. If we want to claim him as our ancestor, as our progenitor, as the root of who we are, stories of Abraham. How did he treat strangers? How did he treat others? He immigrates from Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan, and what does the Torah tell us? He makes friends. B'nai Bayit. He has partners with whom he shares common purpose. He interacts with the religious leadership of the native peoples in the area. Melchizedek, priest. There is respect. There's appreciation for the other. There's a willingness to strive and fight together for what is best for the community. Abraham made people welcome in his tent. All people, any people. It was, according to the Midrash, a tent that was open on all four sides so that you never had to walk around to find the entry. It was a place of greeting and of welcome. It was the place where Abraham played out the deepest belief of the Torah that all people have a spark of sanctity embedded within them. When I elevate my faith, my belief, such a degree that anything I do is right, then I have distorted and betrayed the essential nature of what it means to be a descendant of Abraham. Chaverim, we got a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. Because it is easier for those who exercise indiscriminate power to be victorious. It is up to us who want to be the true expression of Abraham in the modern world, truly live authentically by our faith, by our example, show others what it means to be a true descendant of the patriarch to whom we all. Haverim, let me invite you to turn back to your Sidurim, and we'll continue with the Chatzi Kaddish in the middle of page 184.